The arrow left Maren's fingers before she had time to think. It was instinct, 20 years of instinct, that sent the bolt singing through the morning fog before her mind could fully process what her eyes were seeing. The shaft struck the oak tree 2 inches to the left of the creature's flank, close enough to feel the displaced air, and then the thing simply looked at her, not startled, not fleeing. It looked at her the way a scholar looks at a poorly cited manuscript, with mild, patient disappointment. Maren Ashford lowered her crossbow with hands she refused to let tremble. She had hunted in 12 kingdoms. She had tracked a remorhaz across the frozen tundra north of Icewind Pass for 6 days without sleep, surviving on pine bark and stubborn pride. She had cornered a wyvern in a sea cave during high tide, using nothing but a climbing harness, a short sword, and a complete disregard for self-preservation. She had once, on a particularly disastrous contract, helped bring down a young purple dragon by luring it into a ravine filled with 3 months' worth of carefully accumulated alchemist's fire. The Guild of Verdant Wardens still told that story at their winter galas. They usually got the details wrong. None of that prepared her for this. The creature standing at the edge of the Mirewood Fen was approximately the size of a large draft horse. Its body was unmistakably feline, low-slung shoulders, haunches coiled with potential energy, a long tail that moved with the slow deliberation of smoke in still air. But where a great cat's coat would ripple with muscle and fur, this animal's hide seemed to exist in a state of quiet argument with light itself. The morning sun, weak and gray as it filtered through the canopy of Mirewood's ancient elms, simply didn't land on the creature correctly. The shadows fell at angles that didn't match the angle of the light. Its eyes, when they settled on Maren, were the deep amber of old honey. And they held something that no predator's eyes had any business holding. Intelligence. Measured, unhurried, and entirely unbothered. Right, Maren said aloud, to no one in particular. She had a habit of narrating difficult situations. Her old mentor Callum had called it an endearing quirk. Her last hunting partner had called it unnerving. Right, you're not in the bestiary. She had memorized the Warden's Compendium of Magical Fauna, all 7 volumes, including the appendices on theoretical creatures that no living hunter had documented. She had cross-referenced it with the Dusk Hollow Archives field notes, which ran to 11 hand-copied volumes and smelled permanently of damp linen and someone's long-ago breakfast. She could identify 163 species of magical predator by track, scat, or sound alone. She had tested this claim twice, once in front of the Guild Review Board and once to win a wager in a tavern in Saltmere. She had won both times. Whatever this was, it wasn't in any of those pages. The contract had seemed straightforward, as contracts go. A farming settlement on the southern edge of Mirewood, Thatchel's Hollow. A cluster of 40-some families who grew barley, kept sheep, and wanted absolutely nothing to do with the wilderness pressing in on their eastern fields, had reported livestock disappearing. 3 sheep in a fortnight, no blood, no visible signs of struggle. Just gone. The tracks left behind were large and feline, which meant either a displacer beast or something in that family, and Maren had hunted displacer beasts before. Nasty work. Their natural displacement magic made them extraordinarily difficult to hit. And they were bad-tempered besides, but manageable. She had ridden out from Saltmere 3 days ago, followed the tracks to the edge of the fen, and camped overnight to pick them up again in the dawn light. The trail was excellent. Fresh, clear, methodical. Whatever was hunting, Thatchel's Hollow knew exactly where it was going and wasn't particularly concerned about being followed. She should have found that odd earlier. The creature had not moved. It had sat down, in the interval between her lowering her crossbow and her cataloging her own mounting confusion, with its tail curled, precisely around its front paws, like a house cat settling in for the long part of a lecture. The impossible shadows still played across its coat. Its amber eyes had not left her face. From somewhere in the canopy overhead, a single wren sang 4 notes and went silent. Maren had a policy about creatures that looked at her the way this one was looking at her. The policy was, load a second bolt, back toward your horse, and consult someone smarter than yourself at the earliest opportunity. She began to implement the first step of this policy. The creature tilted its head, perhaps 8 degrees to the left. The crossbow bolt she had just drawn from her quiver slipped from her fingers, hit a root, and bounced into the undergrowth. She stared at the creature. It had not moved. Its tail, however, had, in the brief moment of her attention being on the fallen bolt, shifted from one side to the other. A slow metronome sweep that might have been amusement, if amusement were a thing, that 400-pound magical felines were capable of expressing. Maren took a breath. She was, above all things, a practical woman. She had not survived 2 decades of contract hunting by insisting that reality conform to her expectations of it. "All right," she said, and she heard her own voice come out steadier than she'd expected. "All right, let's try something else." She opened her hands, both of them, crossbow held loosely in her left, and waited. The creature regarded her for a long moment. Then it stood unhurriedly, with the fluid economy of something that had never in its life made an unnecessary movement, and turned its great head toward the deeper fen, and back to her, and toward the fen again. 20 years of tracking told Maren exactly what that meant. It wanted her to follow. Every instinct she had screamed that this was a catastrophically bad idea. She was alone, half a day's ride from the nearest settlement, in a fen with a documented history of magical instability going back to at least the Second Age, being invited deeper into the wilderness by a creature that should not, by any classification she knew, exist. She picked up the fallen bolt, tucked it back in her quiver, and followed. The fen swallowed her by degrees. Mirewood's outer edges were merely unpleasant, boggy ground that sucked at boots, elder trees whose roots erupted from the soil in arthritic tangles, and the persistent smell of standing water and old peat that clung to everything in a radius of 3 miles. But as Maren followed the creature deeper, the quality of the light changed. It became less like filtered sunlight and more like something that light itself had given up trying to reach, as though the canopy above had made a collective decision to handle illumination independently, through some other, quieter arrangement with the sky. She had been in magically saturated environments before. The gray wood in the Far East hummed with a kind of ambient enchantment that made compasses unreliable, and caused horses to develop sudden, passionate opinions about which direction was north. The Silvermarsh south of the Aldenmere Range had a tendency to fold certain types of sound in on themselves, so that whispered conversations in one clearing could be heard with perfect clarity a quarter-mile away while shouts vanished entirely. Mirewood had no such known properties, at least not in any text Maren had encountered. She was beginning to suspect the texts had missed something important. The creature moved ahead of her with perfect unhurried certainty, pausing occasionally at the edge of particularly treacherous ground and waiting for her to find footing before continuing. This consideration, there was no other word for it, sat in Maren's mind like a splinter that she couldn't stop probing. Predators did not exhibit consideration. Predators exhibited hunger, caution, territorial aggression, and in the more intelligent species, calculated patience. They did not pause at muddy crossings and look back to make sure a following human was managing adequately. She found herself cataloging details the way she always did when confronted with an unknown specimen, because cataloging was how her mind made sense of things it hadn't seen before. The creature's tracks were unusual, 4-toed, with retractile claw marks that appeared and vanished inconsistently, as though the decision to extend them was entirely deliberate. The stride was longer than a natural feline of equivalent body mass should produce. And there was the matter of the shadows. In the dim, directionless light of the deep fen, with no strong sun to create sharp angles, the shadows should have been unremarkable. Instead, they still fell wrong around the creature's body, not the clean displacement she associated with displacer beasts, whose illusion magic projected a false image slightly offset from their true position, but something subtler and stranger. The shadows seemed to be in conversation with the creature rather than cast by it. They pulled and shifted in ways that softened its outline, that made its edges uncertain, that meant Maren was never quite sure, from moment to moment, precisely where the animal's body ended and the surrounding air began. She had read about this, she realized. Once, in a footnote. In Volume 6 of the Compendium, in a discussion of theoretical creature classifications, there was a single paragraph clearly added by a different hand than the rest of the text, in slightly different ink, with the cramped precision of someone who had written it quickly and nervously about a category of being that the author had labeled, with evident discomfort, liminal fauna. The paragraph said only that certain environments of sufficient magical age and saturation might, over enough centuries, produce creatures that existed in the boundary space between natural and arcane that were neither fully magical constructs nor purely biological animals, but but something that had grown in the gap between those categories and taken on properties of both. The author had concluded the footnote with the notation, "No confirmed sightings. Category theoretical." See also Boundary Magic Volume 2 pages 340 to 341. Maren had never tracked down volumes 340 to 341. She was beginning to regret that. They had been walking for nearly an hour when the creature stopped. They had reached a small island of relatively dry ground in the midst of the fen, elevated perhaps 3 feet above the surrounding bog, crowned with a stand of ancient hawthorn trees whose trunks had grown into each other over what must have been centuries, until they formed something close to a solid wall. In the center of the clearing that these trees enclosed, the ground was covered in a thick, soft moss that held the quality of color peculiar to deep forest spaces, that particular green that seems less like a color and more like an argument for the existence of green as a concept. And in the middle of that moss, arranged with a neatness that unmistakably indicated deliberate placement, were the remains of 3 sheep. Maren stopped walking. She had been wrong about the kills. That was the first thing. She had assumed predation, a creature hunting livestock for food. The sheep had not been eaten. They had been laid out with considerable care, positioned on their sides with their legs folded, their wool still largely intact, their faces arranged toward the center of the hawthorn ring. Around them, the moss had been scraped away in a careful circle, and the dark earth beneath was marked with shallow grooves, lines and arcs that Maren, staring, slowly recognized as deliberate. It was a circle of warding, a rough one, the kind a person might draw who knew the principle but not the precise academic form, but unmistakably a warding circle. The same basic structure that hedge witches used, that village wise women marked on their doorsteps during the wild storms of late autumn. It was the sort of protective mark that anyone who grew up in a region with magical wildlife learned to draw before they learned to read. Someone had drawn this. Something had drawn this. Maren looked at the creature, who had settled at the edge of the clearing and was watching her with its amber eyes. "You weren't hunting them," she said slowly. "You were protecting them." The great tail swept once, left to right. She looked more carefully at the sheep. They appeared, at this proximity, to be entirely unharmed. The chests of all 3 were rising and falling with the slow, deep rhythm of sleep rather than the stillness of death. She crossed the moss carefully, instinct making her step around the ward circle rather than through it, and crouched beside the nearest animal. Its fleece was warm. Its breathing was steady and deep. Not dead, sleeping. She straightened and looked around the clearing with different eyes, reinterpreting what she was seeing. The warding circle. The sleep, not predator-inflicted death but some kind of magical rest. The deliberate arrangement. The creature's behavior, the tracks that led away from Thatchel's Hollow rather than toward it, heading into the fen where the animals would be safe rather than into the settlement where they could be slaughtered. The way it had looked at her when she'd shot at it, not with aggression but with that weary patience. Something was wrong in Thatchel's Hollow. Something the creature understood and she didn't yet. The walk back was different from the walk in. The creature led her by a different route, faster, less circuitous, and Maren had the distinct impression that the earlier path had been chosen with her uncertain footing in mind rather than any navigation preference of the creature's own. They emerged from the deep fen onto higher ground as the sun reached its midday position, and for the first time since entering the trees that morning, Maren could see open sky. She used the time to think. The most important question, and she had trained herself, very deliberately, to identify the most important question in any confusing situation and work from there, was not what the creature was. That was interesting, professionally relevant, and likely to occupy her for years. But it was not the most important question right now. The most important question was, what did it know about Thatchel's Hollow that had moved it to protect those animals? She thought about the settlement as she'd ridden through it 3 days ago, 40 families, barley fields, sheep meadows. A village green with a well, a mill, a tavern called the Drowned Sparrow that smelled of wood smoke and salted fish. She'd spoken to the headman, a compact and permanently worried-looking man named Aldrich Fenworth, who had described the livestock disappearances with the particular kind of controlled panic of a person who has decided not to panic because panicking won't help, but is having a very difficult time with this decision. She'd spoken to 2 of the farmers who'd lost animals, walked the field boundaries, examined the tracks. She had not spoken to the children. This occurred to her now with the sudden sharp weight of an oversight recognized too late. She had spoken to adults only, the headman, the farmers, the tavern keeper who had given her a room. Children were often the most accurate witnesses in situations involving magical wildlife, because children had not yet learned to edit their observations to fit what adults would accept as plausible. Children said exactly what they saw. She looked at the creature. "How far is the settlement from here?" The creature turned and began walking and did not slow to accommodate her. They reached the edge of Thatchel's Hollow just as the afternoon light began to lean toward gold. The creature stopped at the field boundary, a low stone wall, the kind built by hand over generations with whatever rocks came up during plowing, and sat there with the same patient immobility with which it seemed to do everything, making it clear it would not go further, but equally clear that it expected Maren too. She left her horse tied to a fence post and went into the village on foot. What she found in the next hour rewrote everything she thought she knew about the contract. It started with a girl of perhaps 10, sitting on the steps of the mill and drawing in the dust with a stick. Maren sat down near her, at an angle that communicated company rather than interrogation, and waited. The girl, Nessa, she said her name was, when she decided to speak, drew animals mostly. Large cats, it transpired. She drew them with the specific anatomical confidence of someone drawing from memory rather than imagination. "You've seen it," Maren said. Nessa nodded. She had seen it first 3 weeks ago, she said. It had been at the edge of the east field at twilight, just looking at the village. At first she'd been frightened, but then she'd noticed it wasn't looking at the village exactly. It was looking at the mill, at the millstone mechanism specifically, and at the watershed gate on the mill pond. And here was where everything changed. Maren went to look at the watershed gate. It was to the uninformed eye unremarkable, a heavy wooden gate with iron fittings, controlling the flow of water from the mill pond into the irrigation channels that fed the barley fields. She examined it for 10 minutes before she found it, and when she found it, her stomach dropped with the particular feeling of recognizing something you really did not want to have found. Someone had carved a glyph into the gate's lower timber. Fresh carving, no more than a month old, the wood still clean and pale where the blade had been. She didn't recognize the precise form, but she recognized the family, sympathetic magic notation, the kind used in ritual workings that required anchoring to a physical object. Specifically, the class of sympathetic notation used in workings that drew something toward a location or trapped something within one. She went back to the headman's house. The confrontation that followed was not something Maren was proud of, in the sense that she had allowed her voice to rise and had said several things that were accurate, but perhaps not delivered with optimal diplomacy. In her defense, she had just discovered that Aldrich Fenworth, worried headman of Thatchel's Hollow, had approximately 3 months ago made an arrangement with a traveling practitioner of bound magic, a man he described as very reasonable, very professional, to protect his settlement from what he called fen creatures. The arrangement had involved that glyph on the watershed gate, and several others she found marked on fence posts and barn timbers when she went looking. Together, they formed a binding circuit, the same principle as a wizard's alarm spell, but with a cruder, more aggressive intent. They had been designed not to warn of approaching creatures, but to compel them, to draw the fen's natural predators inward and then confuse their navigation, keeping them circling Thatchel's Hollow in a state of agitated disorientation, making them easier to observe, catalog, and if necessary, eliminate. A trap, in other words. A trap for every large predator within 10 miles of the settlement. Including, Maren thought, standing very still in Fenworth's kitchen while he explained himself at length, a creature that had spent the last several weeks very carefully protecting his livestock from whatever had been drawn out of its natural territory by those same glyphs, and redirected in its disorientation toward his fields. The creature at the field boundary had not been hunting Thatchel's Hollow. It had been cleaning up the mess that Thatchel's Hollow had made. She went back to Fenworth with considerably less patience than she'd arrived with, and she told him this, and she watched his face move through a sequence of expressions: denial, confusion, comprehension, and something that landed somewhere between guilt and chagrin, that she had seen many times on many settlements and which she had never entirely stopped finding exhausting. "The binding circuit needs to come down," she told him flatly. "Tonight. I'll help you remove it safely. And then you and I are going to have a very long conversation about what competent magical protection actually looks like. And it is not going to involve anything a traveling practitioner sold you for 3 silver marks. The work of dismantling the binding circuit took until almost midnight. Maren had done this kind of work before, not often, but enough. Removing a sympathetic binding safely required approaching each anchor point in the correct sequence, neutralizing the glyph structure before proceeding to the next, or the residual energy would redistribute itself through the remaining anchors in ways that could be unpredictable and occasionally explosive. She had learned this lesson secondhand from a colleague named Davin Marsh, who had dismantled a binding circuit incorrectly and spent 3 subsequent weeks explaining to people that no, the singed eyebrows were not permanent. Yes, he understood the smell would fade eventually. The farming families of Thatchel's Hollow turned out, to their credit, to be considerably more helpful once the situation was explained to them. They held lanterns, passed tools, asked sensible questions, and received the answers with the pragmatic acceptance of people who have always lived adjacent to a world where impossible things were occasionally possible and had long ago decided that the practical response to the impossible was just to deal with it competently. Nessa, who had apparently decided that no reasonable interpretation of "you should be in bed" applied to this situation, followed at a careful distance and watched everything with those sharp, cataloging eyes. Maren found herself, in the quieter moments between glyph removals, explaining what she was doing. It seemed like the right thing. The last anchor point was a glyph carved into a wooden post at the northeast corner of the settlement boundary, half hidden by a climbing rose that had been trained up the post over what appeared to be about 15 years of patient cultivation. Maren neutralized it with a thin-bladed knife and a process she thought of as careful disagreement, the technique her mentor Callum had taught her, which involved identifying the intent of the glyph and systematically negating it rather than simply destroying the physical marks, which tended to leave residue. When the final glyph was neutralized, she felt the circuits collapse the way you sometimes felt a change in air pressure before a storm. A slight, whole-body awareness of something that had been present ceasing to be present. The night air around Thatchel's Hollow felt very suddenly like ordinary night air. She was walking back toward the village center with Fenworth when movement at the field boundary caught her eye. The creature was still there. Maren walked to the wall alone. Fenworth stayed back, not, she thought, from cowardice, but from the specific wisdom of a person who has just been comprehensively educated about his own mistakes and has decided to make himself unobtrusive for a while. She stood at the wall in the darkness and looked at the creature, and the creature looked back at her. The impossible shadows had settled, she realized, not gone, but quieted, as though something that had been agitated in the creature's presence was now at rest. Its amber eyes were the only bright things in the dark field. "This circuit is down," she said. "The compulsion is gone. You can go back to whatever you were doing before all this." The creature did not move for a long moment. Then it looked toward the fen and back at her, with that exact same motion it had made that morning when it had invited her to follow. The same tilt of the great head. The same quality of attention, but different now. Not an invitation, an acknowledgement. Maren thought about 20 years of contracts. She thought about the compendium with its confident classifications, about the guild with its rubrics and ratings and the very specific vocabulary it used to define the relationship between hunters and hunted. She thought about a footnote she'd read once in Volume 6, written by a nervous hand in slightly different ink, about creatures that existed in the boundary space between what she knew and what she hadn't known yet. "I'd like to understand what you are," she said. "Properly. Not to classify you. Not for a contract. Because you are something I have never seen before, and I have spent 20 years being very certain I understood what was out there, and you are telling me I was wrong about that." The amber eyes held steady. "I'll need time," she said. "And I'll need to come back. And I won't bring a loaded crossbow." She felt rather than heard the sound that came from the creature then, very low, in a register that was less about the ears than about the chest, and the understanding the way a great bell's resonance continues after the strike has passed. It was not a growl. It was not quite anything she had a name for. But it moved through her with the quality of something significant, something that she would spend a considerable amount of time afterward trying to properly articulate, and in the end she would write it down as consent. The creature turned and walked into the fen without hurrying, and the night closed around it. And Maren was alone at the wall in the dark with the sound of distant frogs and the smell of peat. And the full weight of the thing she had just committed to. Behind her, she heard small, careful footsteps. Nessa, who had followed at a safe distance throughout the entire evening's work, arrived at the wall and looked out at the fen's dark edge with the specific wide-eyed attention of a child who has witnessed something large, and is very quietly deciding what to do with it. Maren looked down at her. Nessa looked up. "Are you going to come back?" Nessa asked. Maren thought about the fen. She thought about the creature's amber eyes and its impossible shadows and its careful, patient regard. She thought about 7 volumes of a bestiary that suddenly had at least one significant gap in it. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to need a lot more time in that fen." Nessa considered this. "I know all the safe paths," she said, with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who has been exploring since before she was old enough to be told not to. "I could show you." Maren looked at her for a moment, then looked back at the fen. "I'd like that," she said. And in the long silence that followed, the fen breathed around them, patient and old and full of things that had been there long before anyone had thought to name them, and the night felt less like an ending, than like the first page of something much larger, a field guide with all its entries still blank, waiting for the slow, careful, honest work of attention. 6 months later, a new volume appeared in the restricted collection of the Saltmere Guild of Verdant Wardens. It was a slim thing compared to the compendium's 7 volumes, barely 80 pages, hand-lettered in a precise and familiar script, with careful ink illustrations that combined naturalist accuracy with an unusual quality of patience, as though the artist had observed their subject over a very long time and from a respectful distance. The title page read, "Observations on Liminal Fauna of the Mirewood Fen, Preliminary Notes." Volume 1, the author listed was M. Ashford, Senior Warden, with a secondary credit that read simply, "Field Access and Local Knowledge." In Fenworth, Thatchel's Hollow, the Guild's senior archivist, a man of 40 years' practice who had read more field reports than he cared to count, read it twice in one sitting. Then he read it a 3rd time. Then he sat for a while in his chair looking at the middle distance, which was something he had not done in quite this way since the year a junior warden had submitted a report claiming to have verified the existence of a Tarrasque hibernation chamber beneath the Alden Mere Range, an event which had turned out to be substantially less exciting than that, but had still required several weeks of careful investigation. The volume contained no formal classification of the creature Maren had designated Subject 1. Instead, it contained 80 pages of precisely recorded observation, behavioral notes, environmental data, documentation of the creature's apparent capacity for abstract problem-solving and premeditated protective behavior, careful descriptions of the shadow phenomenon and its apparent relationship to the creature's internal state, and a series of ethological analyses that drew careful parallels to several known magical species while making clear that Subject 1 fit neatly into none of them. The final page contained a single paragraph that the archivist found himself reading several times. It said, "In 20 years of contracted work, I operated on the assumption that the function of documentation was classification, that to name and categorize a thing was to understand it. Subject 1 has persuaded me that this assumption has a significant flaw. Some things in the world are best approached not as categories to be filled, but as questions to be continued. This volume is not a conclusion. It is, with the full awareness of what that means for the amount of work remaining, a beginning. In Thatchel's Hollow, the barley harvest that autumn was excellent. The watershed gate had been repaired, and the climbing rows had been carefully retrained around the new timber. And on quiet evenings when the light went gold over the east fields, and the fen breathed its slow breath beyond the stone wall, some of the village children could sometimes be seen sitting on the boundary wall, looking into the long grass with that particular quality of attentiveness that means someone is watching for something specific, not with fear, with the comfortable readiness of people who have learned that extraordinary things are sometimes simply neighbors. Nessa Fenworth, 10 years old and already halfway through the first of what would eventually number 16 personal field notebooks, sat on that wall most evenings. She was a patient observer. She was learning to draw tracks. She was learning the difference between a shape and a shadow, and between a shadow and something that used shadows the way most things use skin. And sometimes in the long amber quiet of the evening, at the exact point where the domestic and the wild met at a low stone, wall in a place where someone had once made a careless mistake and where something patient and ancient had chosen nonetheless to help. She would look up from her notebook and find two amber eyes regarding her from the edge of the fen. Not hunting, not testing, just watching. The way you watch something you have decided slowly and without announcement to trust. O destino desta historia, esta nas suas mas. Se voca acredita que o heroi não está sozinho. Dic su like. Se voca vaio o que os outros não viram. Escreva sua teoria nos comentários. E se voca precisa saber o que acontece a seguir, inscreva-se. O próximo capítulo vai mudar tudo.